Hey, fellow G&Ters, those of us who like our spirituality with a twist. In this second episode of our four-part series, we continue our discussion with the profound, jovial, and enlightening Glenn H. Mullin, or simply Lama Glenn to his students. Lama Glenn's bio is a long one, so if you're curious about the longer, more complete version, it is in the first episode of the series. The shorter version goes, Lama Glenn traveled from Canada and lived in the Indian Himalayas between 1972 and 1984, where he met the Dalai Lama, and then stayed on and studied with 35 of the greatest living masters of the four schools of Tibetan Buddhism. Drawing on those experiences, he's the author of over 30 books on Tibetan Buddhism, especially focused on the Dalai Lamas and the practice traditions of Buddhism, particularly the Tantric tradition. He has been an international teacher of Tantric Buddhist meditation for the past 25 years. His expertise in Asian culture extends to art, and he has curated a number of important Buddhist art exhibitions and is an advocate for artists of the East, helping to make their work available to collectors in the West. He is currently at work on a book on Nicholas Roerich, the great Russian painter, spiritual figure, and social activist. Lama Glenn is also an expert in travel to the sacred sites of the Himalayas. He leads tours and acts as a consultant advisor to those wanting to travel safely and meaningfully through those sacred sites. Finally, Lama Glenn is an activist in allowing Western folks to help support spiritual practice and activity in the East. I personally have helped sponsored retreats with his help. It's always good to try to give back a little if one can. Okay, in this episode we talk about different types of spiritual lifestyles, whether one is a spiritual beggar, as monastics tend to be called in the East, or a spiritual seeker, living as a layperson, as they also do in the East and most of us will do in the West. We also talked about fun in spiritual practice and how many times a day a good Buddhist can have sex. The answer may surprise you. Enjoy the episode.
Welcome to Jen and Tantra, Spirituality with a Twist. The podcast that takes Tantrism, Buddhism, Taoism, Sufism, Kabbalism, Shamanism, Chinese medicinism, and all of the other isms we've been influenced by, and blends them into a tall, crisp, cool cocktail your spirit has been longing for.
I want you to get together.
Now, isn't that refreshing?
I want you to get together.
When you were in Dharamsala, you've lived your life as a layperson. Was there any temptation of becoming a monk? I know Robert Thurman's kind of famous for becoming, pursuing that monk route and then not pursuing it. Did that cross your mind at all, or you always knew you were going to live as a layperson?
Even as a young child, I did have a kind of a vision of myself becoming a monk. I mean, I could often, if I just sat in quietly like this, I could often feel myself being in monk's robes. It was almost like I was a monk in a human disguise or something, a non-monk disguise. I really did have that very deep feeling. But when I was in Europe, I met a wonderful Jewish lady from New York City, and we got married, and we went to India together.
Oh, okay. So you're already a married person.
Well, we weren't legally married, but we were together, so that's a kind of a marriage.
Yeah.
In Canada, if you're together for any amount of time, you're just declared by the government married, so that you don't try to use it to your tax advantage. For a while, that wasn't the case, So and then people would get married. They wouldn't get married, but then one would put a tent in the backyard of the house and say, "No, I'm living there." And a double tax benefit. But anyway, yeah. So, and after I was there for about 2 years, there was kind of a big become a monk movement with certain groups, especially with Lama Yeshe, Lama Zopa, the foundation, the PMT, Foundation for Preservation. And I was quite I really was very impressed by Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa, and I received teachings from both of them almost from the beginning, because although they lived in Nepal, they came to Bodh Gaya every winter to attend Dalai Lama's teachings, and sometimes would do things down there at Dalai Lama's request. And also they would come to Dharamsala to attend Dalai Lama's teachings. And so I knew both of them, and quite a few of my friends became monks. And I was thinking about it, and I didn't discuss it with my lady friend, with my partner, because I thought if I do and then I don't become a monk, she'll hold it against me. Women never forget. I don't know if you've noticed, but they never forget.
Words of wisdom, Lama Glenn.
If I go shopping, I have to write everything on the list. If I don't write it, I'll forget one or two things. A lady could have a shopping list of 300 things and come back with 305. But anyway, I went to Kimji Ling Dorje Chung, the Dalai Lama's senior guru, senior tutor, who also was my main kind of tantric person in my mind, because I received Yamateka initiation from him at Christmas of 72, or just after New Year, 73, at that period, and had a very, very strong experience. So really looked to him as kind of my main spiritual guide, if you will. So I went and visited, and I asked him what he thought, and he picked up his dice and went, no.
Well, I mean, I think...
Then he laughed a little bit, and he said, there's really, in terms of enlightenment, there's no benefit. That becoming a monk is a lifestyle choice, and everyone has their own kind of path. And over history, there's been many great enlightened beings who were not monks. And, he mentioned people, Padmasambhava and Marpa and Milarepa, Tisha's great disciple, Lamdrumpa, many of the early Sakya Lamas, and so on and so forth. So he went on with a list, and he said, for enlightenment, it's becoming a monk or not becoming a monk is nothing to do with that decision. It's a lifestyle choice. Being a monk has some advantages, also has some disadvantages. And so you're better off to practice they don't say layperson in that kind of a way. They use one of two words, either genyen, and a genyen means kind of like spiritual seeker. And a monk, they don't use the word monk, they say gelong. Gelong means spiritual beggar. Because it means monks aren't supposed to touch money, and they're not supposed to save any food or anything or have any possessions. It's kind of the Buddhist equivalent in India of a vow of poverty. And so gelong means you need sponsors to, in India, you would just have to be accepted into a little temple group, and then every morning, usually 7 or 8 o'clock, you go out and beg, stand in the street with your bowl until it was full, and you would have one meal at noontime. So that's how it was. And of course, in Tibet, it wasn't like that. India wasn't like that. Or the Far East, these are northern countries. So, those long winters, people would freeze to death standing out there with a little bowl. The meaning is actually that. So Genya means spiritual seeker, and otherwise they will use the word ngakpa, which means a tantric practitioner. So I don't remember which of those was used, but the two terms used, although we translate as layperson or monk in English, the words in Tibetan are spiritual seeker or spiritual beggar. And so
when he said that he threw his dice, not for you, were you more like, I'm relieved, or were you more like, oh, rats?
Well, there was a certain kind of pleasure in the idea of being a monk. You get to sit at the front of sort of some gatherings, and you get a few privileges here and there. You get people make offerings to you and what have you. I mean, that's the meaning of spiritual beggar, right? That's the meaning of the word monk, is people make offerings to you. You don't farm, you don't fish, you're not a carpenter, you don't have a job. Your income is basically offerings given by those who are not spiritual beggars. And so anyway, for me, I think it was kind of a good feeling of clarification. You know, if there's one of those kind of things, should I, shouldn't I, should I, shouldn't I, should I, shouldn't I? You know, it's like if you go to a bar at night and as a young man, and there's like 3 girls and they all show interest in you, and you're looking one, which one? Then if you keep doing that all night, you go home alone because you missed your chance.
You need some wise Tibetan man to throw the dice for you then on the bar top, right?
And then you could strike out with confidence.
Become a monk. It was like, you know, I mean, becoming a monk would have some advantages, and in lifestyle, as Rinpoche put it, and not becoming a monk had advantages for it in lifestyle.
What did you see? What did you see amongst the other Americans who were there, or Western Canadians, Americans, and so on, who were going to that path? Did they tend to stick that out, or? Well,
you know, you mentioned Bob Thurman. He became a monk against the advice of his guru, Geshe Wangyal. He asked Geshe Wangyal about becoming a monk, and that was his kind of main teacher in the States. And Geshe Wangyal said, no, you're better off to, go to college, get your PhD, and be a spiritual seeker rather than a spiritual beggar. But, you know, I don't know if you know Bob very well, but he's a very, very wonderful human being, and a very, very dear friend. And I would say one of the great Buddhist personalities and geniuses of my generation. But he is headstrong. Being headstrong can work for you or against you. So even though he told me this story, he said, even though Geshe Wangyal told me, no, I thought, well, I really want to become a monk. So he went to Dharmsund. He went to Ling Rinpoche, and I think Ling Rinpoche said, oh, well, you'll have to discuss it with the Dalai Lama, you know. So then he went up to Dalai Lama and asked for ordination, and Dalai Lama said, okay. Then he was a monk for a couple of years, but then realized Geshe Wangyal had been right from the beginning. You know, I think becoming a monk is okay if you want to live in one of the monasteries and have all the benefits of monastery life, and have the kind of emotional, intellectual, environmental support that you get with living with, you know, anywhere from 20 to 5,000 others in that same lifestyle.
We're motivated in that same way to pursue those same ends.
Like everyone around you is all no whiskey, no sex, you know, go to bed early, get up early. If they're all in that same thing, it's easy for you to do it. But then if, like Bob, you come back to the States and you're the only monk for 100 miles around, and you walk around looking like a bit of a weirdo. And especially in that time, I think there was sort of a backlash against kind of weird cults like the Hare Krishna people and Maharishi Mahesh. Ramana Maharshi people, those kind of things. And I think that kind of outer, and nobody understood what is a monk over here. You know, nobody would look at now if you wear robes like the Dalai Lama, everyone thinks, oh, you must be like a Dalai Lama monk or something like that, right? But back in the late 60s or early 70s, that wasn't there. And so I think, you know, for him it was difficult. Many other monks come over determined to be monks. Even amongst Tibetans, they try to stay monks, but they find it not that easy, you know, Western lifestyle when they're living by themselves, having their own cash flow, having to manage their own bank accounts and do everything. And you can't walk outside with like a begging bowl and just stand in the street. You know?
No one's going to know what to do with you, right? Yeah.
It's not Thailand or something, Burma or something like that. They wouldn't have a clue what that's about. And so I think, he's, you know, came to see very clearly. And he was back with Geshe Wangyal, who's saying, I told you so, I told you so. But many of my other friends who became monks in India, when they came back, found it kind of uncomfortable. Just little things, like going to dinner and all of, with mixed groups and the kind of things that go on in dinner things, or going out to, evening events and dinners, dinner clubs and restaurants and all that sort of thing. It's kind of a little bit uncomfortable sticking out like that. So I would say probably 90% of Western people, who became monks in Dharamsala, later gave that up. Examples, Alan Wallace, he stopped being a spiritual beggar and he became a spiritual seeker. And now he's a very well known, very well respected, very accomplished Buddhist teacher, probably in the Tibetan tradition, one of the 5 or 6 most successful, I would say.
That's the really interesting thing about it. And it's kind of like a fascination of the show, because people like you, or Robert Thurman or B.L.N. Wallace, you all made a big influence on people in a non-monastic lifestyle. So it's not like that didn't translate into great things in terms of helping a lot of people. I think it really did, right?
Well, certainly. I have no regrets over not becoming a monk.
Yeah. I have no regrets of you not becoming a monk too, Lama Glenn.
And I'm sure had I become a monk, I probably would have become an ex-monk. The word in Tibetan is tralukpa, which means something like a fallen monk or something like that. Lukpa means turned back monk.
Yeah.
So, in Tibetan, it's a little bit of a derogatory term because it is a lifetime precept. But on the other hand, Buddha made accommodations for it. So, technically, you can become a monk 3 times. You can give back being a monk twice and become a monk 3 times. The 3rd time you give back, you cannot become a monk again. So examples of that, for instance, Geshe Gyaltsen, a very accomplished Ganden Shartse Geshe, was sent to England in the mid-60s or late 60s when England took over 50 or so Tibetan youth refugees. And the Dalai Lama sent him as kind of their spiritual preceptor, tutor, or I don't know, you say counselor, ombudsman. And after they grew up and finished their education, he disrobed and became a monk. Became a spiritual seeker rather than spiritual beggar. And he taught in England as a non-monk to the Western community. Then he moved to LA. He was invited to LA on a teaching tour and ended up, his wife, I think, left him for someone in LA.
Oh.
So then he became a lonely ex-monk. And then gave back his monk vows. No, and then took monk vows again.
Yeah.
So he became a monk again. And then later, one of his students became a nun, but they decided about 5 years later that they were spending so much time together running, the Dharma Center and all that both of them being monks and sleeping in separate rooms was not that practical. And everyone looking at them like, I wonder what they do when everyone goes away. So they both decided to disrobe and get married. So that was his 2nd time he gave the monk vow. And then they were like that for a few years. And then he again took monk vows just before, a few years before he died. He figured, okay, I think I'd like to die as a monk. And so he died as a monk and spent the last few years as a monk. So Buddha made it possible that if you become a monk and you decide it's not for you, you can honorably give back your robes, which you go to your preceptor, the one you received them from, and said, it's not working out. And then, 5 whatever years later, you change your mind on it. You can come back and say, well, okay, I sorted all that out. I'm ready to go now. Give it another crack. And then 10 years later, things can change. And, your parents will say, oh, you have to come home and make some grandkids for us. And you can say, oh, otherwise we're not going to, sponsor your monastery and punish monks all over the world. Aristocrats do that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
For instance, with Mongolia, one of the history books of Mongolia, why are most Mongolian monks married? These days, most Mongolian monks will say, well, the communists forced us to marry. But there's evidence that this was not the case. There's evidence that maybe 100 or 150 years earlier, one of the Mongolian kings wrote a letter to the Dalai and Panchen Lamas and said, so many of our young men and women are becoming monks and nuns that our population is dropping too much. So we've got a choice here. Either they can marry or else I'm kicking Buddhism out of the country.
Yeah. That pretty much solves that problem.
And so then Panchen Lama, and this history that one of my very dear Mongolian friends was reading to me from Mongolian, said, and so the Panchen Lama wrote back a letter saying, okay, they can marry, but only one wife, one husband. Because otherwise some Mongolian aristocrats would marry 3 or 4 or 5. You can have more than one wife. And he said, and no mistresses. So, Vinaya in that way is somewhat flexible, both legally within Buddhism and then outside of the tradition coming from Buddha himself, adaptations made by various kings. For instance, in Thailand, one of the kings made the rule that if you don't want to join the army, if you've got a strong objection to join the army and doing your army service, you can become a monk for a period. Mm. And so if you have to be drafted for 6 months or a year, no, I'm not the killing type. Then then the king made an option. You say, okay, if you don't want to, which monastery are you joining for the next 6 months or a year? And that changed from that to essentially being, later he made it that anyone can become a monk for a stipulated time period. So you can take a monk vow for, say, a month or 2 months or 3 months. So that's a kind of a political alteration to the tradition, you could say.
So what's interesting about this to me, Lama Glenn, and all of this is there's a kind of a flexibility. And the thing that struck me in first meeting you, and you're kind of one of the first teachers in the Tibetan Buddhist world that I had a connection with, was that there's room for kind of a fun and an enjoyment of life on some level that I just found in what you were doing. I think it's maybe for people who aren't familiar with you and your work and your teaching and all that, it's pretty obvious that you're a person who, knows what fun is and enjoying life. And I had initially had my exposure to Buddhism through Zen, and it was very strict. And then I had this experience of meeting you, and I was like, oh, this is different. This is something where there's a different attitude.
Right. I think the traditions of Zen sort of bring in that sort of stern Chinese kind of quality, mountain Dharma quality that sort of combines the, Bodhidharma, like facing a wall for 9 years and not moving and cutting off his eyelid so that he wouldn't fall asleep and stuff like that. There is a little bit of that even in Indian Buddhism, but that kind of a very stern kind of approach, which comes to Buddhism, I think, Zen Buddhism from the Taoist tradition. Buddha advocated the middle way, and that really means balancing indulgence and non-indulgence, I guess you would say. In other words, having enough fun to make your life fun, but not having so much that you don't get anything else done. Like sex is kind of an example. we shouldn't have sex more than 5 times a day. That's stipulated there.
Distracting for your
Yeah,
meditation.
and now when you see a rule like that, you know that Buddhist rules just came because of complaints, right?
Is that the wording of the rule? Not more than 5 times a day?
There's 6 things are listed for kind of wrong sex, you could say, or actually Tibetan. Sometimes it's called chupa lukpa, which means sort of abusing the sexual instinct or something like that.
Yeah.
But more than 5 times is okay. More than that is too much. And other things are mentioned there as well. That's about the only one I often mention, because I think it says more about the Buddhist attitude towards such things than most other things one can say about sexual regulations.
Yeah.
Other things are like not by force or deceit, like, don't rape anyone, and not with children, pedophilia.
So this is what it's like studying with you, Lama Glenn. You never know where it's going to go.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I want you to get together. I want you together. Put your hands together one time. I want you to get together. I want you to get together.